So what we've done with this next section is we've tried to divide the next sections into the first part of our executive report, which is the state of the American family, and features that all American families seem to hold in common. And the next panel will be focused on the 4 family clusters. So that's how we've structured this. Just to refresh our memory about the executive report, it emerged in our studies that parents are anxious, that parents are close to their children, they wonder if they're doing a good enough job, parents are in denial about their children, and they have various strategies of responding to that. Parents operate very independently compared to in the past. Parents also focus an intense amount of effort on the family itself, and this is in our report. It's called the therapeutic familism. And this, I just want to give a personal response. For me, this is a bit difficult because as someone who has a great emphasis on the family and having good communication in the family and having a sound family structure and so forth, the thought that sometimes that's a little too intense and that there's a loss of other things in the therapeutic familism is something I think we need to explore. So, without further ado, I'm going to introduce our illustrious panelists who are going to just give some responses, informal responses to the state of the American family from their own experience, their own organizations, and then take our questions. So I'll say everyone's name first, and then we'll go right down the line, starting with Eric. Eric Swanson is the Director of Charitable Investing at the Tango Group. And then we have Carey Casey, who is the CEO of the Center for Fathering. Everyone's name is on the back of your schedule, just so you know if you want to do follow-up. And we have Elaina Ouimet, who is the Director of Special Initiatives for the Boys and Girls Club of America. And Lisa Belkin, who is a senior columnist on life, work, and family from the Huffington Post. So we'll start with Mr. Swanson.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, and I've found just this morning already very, very fascinating, as I'm sure you have. And there's nothing like original research and interpretation of the data that to stimulate thinking about new possibilities. As I read through the data, As I read through the data, let me tell you a little bit about what my background is. I work for, as you mentioned, the Tango Group in Boulder, Colorado. And it's basically a private investment company, and we say we invest in vision-led growth companies in the for-profit, non-for-profit sectors, and I've been involved in the non-for-profit sectors. One of the things we're doing there too, though, is we have a great concern for family. The purpose of the company is really to help build healthy and loving families through changed lives. That's our mission statement of the company. For the past 2 or 3 years, we've been very much engaged in trying to figuring out how technology, how this relates to the health of relationships. We've interviewed over 1,400 people one-on-one through phone interviews, 45-minute, 1 to 1 hour interviews, those that are what we call relationship champions, those that spend their waking hours of the day thinking about how to help relationships get better. And second hat I wear those, I also work with another group called Leadership Network out of Dallas, Texas, started by a guy named Bob Buford. And I work with a lot of large churches around the country, along with a lot of pastors. And my role there has really been helping churches get outside the walls, what we call externally focused churches that measure their impact not by their attendance on Sunday morning, but by the transformational effect they have in the communities around them. So those are kind of how I'm viewing the data as an excellent report. And I want to again thank Ashley publicly. She's kind of held my hand just to get me here. I'm calling her a couple days ago. Where am I staying again? Oh, don't worry, just show up and go downstairs. But when I read that, I thought of the sense of people feeling threatened, the families feeling threatened. The things that are conspiring in this life against our families, and so 64% feeling that the family is in decline. The same percentage approximately feeling that our country is in decline. The families feeling isolated, that large percentage of people that have no support and they feel they're all alone in trying to raise their families. 4 out of 5 feel that they feel a concern of the danger for their children. And what was once seen as our friend is now conspiring against us, technology. And it's a little bit, the word that we hear over and over in the report is technology has what? Invaded our homes. And it's almost like we're on the receiving end and we're victims, and that something's conspiring against us. It's like the invasion of the body snatchers. You didn't ever invite them in. They just kind of came and invaded. And so parents, in the midst of that, and I read this, they almost feel like they're powerless. It's those old movies that's, when something invades, the space invaders come, but our weapons are useless against them. All the parenting techniques have, what we tried before, are sort of useless against this invasion of technology. And so it makes the job of parenting so much harder. So 2/3 of people expressed, again, their concern over the invasion of technology. And so I think what began as our friend has now become one of our, perceived as our biggest nightmares. And I almost think of it's a little bit like what some of the classic movies that we grew up with, the sci-fi movies that we grew up with, are made of. It's sort of like when technology goes wrong. It's back with Shelley's Frankenstein. We're going to use science to create a human being out of, but then he turns into a monster. It's the China syndrome. Remember that from the 70s? What the nuclear core melting down and going through the earth. You think of Jurassic Park. They're using science and then it kind of turns against us. Or you've seen the movie I, Robot, where they eventually end up taking over the earth. And so part of it is that things seem out of control and beyond our control to solve. And what happens is there's a juxtaposition of two things that are happening. One, parents feel that through technology, their kids are becoming super powerful, super empowered, while we feel more and more powerless to stop them. And I think most of us, and what really scares us, is that in the back of our mind, we are still picturing our VCR with the flashing 12 on it, going beep, beep, beep. You know why? Because we never even learned how to fix the time on our VCR. And while our kids are just navigating around us. One of the things I saw, sure, parents, we all use technology. Parents use technology. But the gap between our familiarity of technology and our kids' technology creates a mischief gap. And that creates, they're always one step ahead of us, and we come up with solutions, and they just kind of chuckle, and they go, oh man, you thwarted me there. But they've got a network of all their friends. Oh, that's easy to bypass. Just open a new Facebook account. It's that type of thing. And so we feel like that we can't get ahead of the game. 93%, think that of the kids are doing something in tech. And so it's part of what we do then. So like any invasion in these epic movies, we say we've got to come together. We've got to come together and fight these invaders. And yet one of the problems that we face through the four groups that were identified is that we all have a different view of what's going to save us. For the faithful, the hope is in God. For the engaged progressive, the hope is in self, apart from God. For the detached, if you read that, they hope in good luck. They just hope they win the lottery. And I think one of the most underestimated group here are the dreamers, and their hope is education. That 92% of them believe that education is the most important thing compared to 71% of the other group. So part of it, though, is that the good thing, the encouraging thing about this I saw is that people, although they kind of feel they're back on their heels, that most of them, 93%, are engaged in wanting to build moral character into their kids. That very high percentage, 92% of people, want a great life for the kids. I'm kind of getting mixed up in my statistics too, but there's a consensus here. It's the few things that we're bipartisan on. We may disagree on the cause or may disagree on the cure, but we all want the same thing for our kids, and that's a great thing. So in my technology, the role of Tango, I'll just say what we're doing is that the average, that technology has invaded. The pods have set down on Earth all around us. All around our homes, there's pods of technology that have just kind of invaded us. Now what do? The average 18-year-old girl touches this screen 5,000 times a month, whether it's texting, whether it's Facebook, whether it's, I want to say email, but they don't use email, but whatever it is. And so what happens is, whereas before the parents were the conduit to the wisdom of the past generations. If you want to go out and learn to change a carburetor, you'd have to go to your dad to do that. If you want to know how to change the oil, you got to know the car with your dad. They can bypass everything we do via this. And so in a sense, we not only feel powerless, but we feel like we're less needed in their lives. This thing is almost human. It sees, it talks, it hears, it remembers. The only one of the senses this doesn't have is taste and smell. But other than that, this is a pretty good companion. One of the things I noticed, I was sitting up in the front, but I think there were a couple smartphones that were sitting here. If this crowd was 20 years younger, people would be sitting here like this. Under the table, they'd have this under the table, they'd be checking their, because that's what they do. They're connected to the virtual world as they're connected to the physical world. We're still mostly physical world people. So what do you do when you're invaded by technology and you know it's not going away? We can't get rid of it. We have to figure out how to make it our friend. And so the initiative that we're working on in Boulder is, how can you use a smartphone? How can you use something that you have in your pocket? We don't want to go to content anymore. We want content to come to us. But how can we use this to enhance the relationships in our lives that we care most about? In other words, we heard something where the girl comes home and she doesn't want to talk to her mom because she just can't do it. And her mom's sitting on the couch, probably feeling like a failure as a parent. And her screen gets a little bing from her screen that tells her that she has a text message. And here her daughter, and what technology does do though, it allows people to communicate things via all the social media, Twitter, Facebook, all that kind of stuff, that they can't even say one-on-one across the table from a person. Now, how could we use that to our advantage? That's what we need to be thinking about. How can we use this new medium not as our enemy, but if there's things that people are willing to share here, how can we make that happen with husband and wife? How can we make that with parent-child? Things like that, children and children. So that's kind of one of the challenges I face. The second thing I was struck by was that with the faithful, I was disappointed in the faithful. I'm a man of faith, but I'm disappointed with the faithful study. Because even though 97% of them, and I'm assuming mostly Christian Jews, maybe, I don't know if there's any other religions represented here, but 97 have a relationship with God. And the tradition of Scripture says the most important thing you can do, and Jesus was asked the question, what's the most important commandment? He says, love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbors yourself. And being engaged in this world, people kind of think they're doing okay in their relationship with God. But then when you look at the 16%, or the 1 in 6 people in our country that have no social support at all, they're on the wire alone, men and women. They are flying blindly. They're separated from family. They have no support. And who are they? They're the divorced. They're the single moms. They're the poor. They're the undereducated. And ironically, that in today's terms is the very group that Jesus talked about in Matthew 25. When I was hungry, when I was thirsty, when I was naked, when I was in prison, when I was sick. These people. Those become people who simply through their engagement in the life of a congregation have doubled the amount of support of people that don't. And so I think of Robert Putnam's work, and many of you read his work, but in Bowling Alone, he talks about something called social capital. And he says social capital is it comes from the bonds between people. He talks about 2 types of social capital. He calls it about bonded capital, and that's the connections between a different group of people. It's churchgoers, and they have a lot of bonded capital. When my wife was pregnant, 3 times we had kids, I was teaching Sunday school. We got 30 days of frozen dinners. And people would ask me, and, well, do you think, well, maybe that chicken dish would be one, you know. And we took care of each other. And we look out for each other. But there's another type of capital that's just as important, or more important. It's called the bridging capital. And that's the ability of one siloed group to make connections with another siloed group that they have nothing in common with. And the strength of our society is that ability to build bridging capital more than it is even bonding capital. And we need both, but we need people that will go to their neighbors. And so I kind of think about, a friend of mine does this. He asked the mayor to come in and speak to a bunch of pastors in the city, and his pastor outlined all the problems in the city, and then he said this. He said, it just occurred to me that if we were just good neighbors, all the problems that I've talked about would be solved. If you pastors could teach us to love our neighbors as ourselves, all of our problems would be solved. And so again, it's not overly complicated. My friend
Eric, I hate to interrupt you.
I'm done.
You're done.
I'm done. Very good.
But I think you did touch upon one of Pam's core concerns, which is how can we highlight the real problems? And the lack of social connection and the lack of knowing neighbor has certainly got to be on our list, I think.
I love your timing.
So thank you.
I agree.
Carey.
So I have this much time that Eric took.
What did I take, 35 minutes?
A little bit less, maybe, if you could shave off a little bit.
I'm kidding. But I would like to thank Dr. James Hunter, my new friend, for allowing me to be here, and Ashley corresponding in a great way and getting us here as well. And I understand she is Episcopalian, and so I'm not making fun, but I am CEO at the National Center for Fathering, but before that time, I am an ordained Black Baptist preacher, so I would try not to go as long as my colleague here. But anyway, we could be here all day, but I'm just kidding. But Eric is a wonderful man. I love being with him, but I think of some of what he was stating. I'm very blessed. My father, years ago in this dear city, on a hot, sweltering day, August 1963, he heard a father talk about his dream for his children. You know, Dr. Martin Luther King. My pop was here. I was 8 years old. I remember when he came here, and when he came back home, he was so excited and sharing with my mom about what would take place in the future. And so being here today, I'm humbled as I think about University of Virginia, the work that is going on at the Institute there, talking about the 4 clusters and about family. I'm thankful that I had a dad that was there for me. And so I have the privilege of being a father now myself. And this data, I was so thrilled to read it. I look forward to marinating on it even in a deeper way with my colleagues at the National Center for Fathering, because these days it's great to have footnotes and bibliography for what you do. So this data will really help us. And I'm a little dysfunctional, but during Christmas, I will be at home, and my bride, who I met in geography class at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, if God isn't a Tar Heel, then why is the sky Carolina blue? But he is not helping us win games these days. But met her in geography class, and now we have 3 grown children, and we kept having fun. Now we have Chance. He's 15. I was wondering why he came into our lives at 41. I'm 57. And the reason why is because he keeps my fathering fresh and they help our family. But we will have this report with our 4 children and our 7 grandchildren during Christmas, and we're going to have discussion. My children are all college educated and scholars, if you will, and so we will study and talk about, you know, the faithful and detached and all of this and the progressive. And so I am very thrilled that you all have helped me personally with my fathering, but then quite naturally at the National Center for Fathering also. And we know at the center that every child needs a father, grandfather, or father figure. And when a daddy's not there, a child more likely to be poor, drop out of school, be involved in crime, you know that. And then girls more likely to be pregnant as a teenager. When daddy's there, no perfect dads, but when daddy's there, those statistics flip-flop. I'm not perfect. My dad wasn't perfect, but I'm enjoying being a father. But I think about some of what Eric was stating, talking about the technology, and he's totally right. And a few years ago, I remembered Chance came into the Carolina room. We have a Carolina room in my home. My bride designed it. And I'm a Christian as well. And that's where I go and have devotion. And I prayed for you all. Believe it or not, we have an altar in there. And so I prayed for us in coming here. We're of faith. But anyway, when he was 10, he's 15 now. And he came in, Daddy, what are you doing? I said, son, I'm reading my Bible. I see you doing that, Dad. But what are you reading? I said, I'm reading a proverb, son. And you got to get wisdom. Have knowledge. He's on the honor roll and all of that. But I said, son, you must get wisdom, discernment. You know, as you're talking at the cafeteria table, kids are at his public school, just to make it plain, having sex in the bathroom. At his school, very nice suburban school. But it's not always just a boy and a girl, believe it or not. And so we have discussions that are deep, and I have to enter into his world. I learned through the study here, of all this going on, I don't sit and look at Chance like this and scour down my nose. I have to be open in this type of thing. I can't button my coat up like it is now. I have to open it up maybe and take the tie off and engage and have conversation with him. But he sat on my lap and things, and I would read to him when he was 10. And then I said, son, why do you like to sit on Daddy's lap? He said, it's because you're warm. It gets a little cold in Kansas City. Then he said this, he's a knucklehead, but he made it plain. He said, Daddy, I feel safe and secure. And your research here, and what you're talking about, protecting, through our research at the National Center for Fathering, we know that a daddy provides and he protects. The way Daddy taught me how you handle money. Well, we talk about depending on the government and all of that. But my father schooled me. He showed me how he gave to the church and how he took care of his money. Chance has the same opportunity. But he said he feels safe and secure. Another thought he said, and I like to smell your coffee breath and all of this. But here's the thing. We read a proverb together every day, just like some people read any book. But we read Proverbs, get wisdom. From when he was 10, and he's 15 now. And I've never heard an audible voice from God, but he basically let me know, don't explain it to Chance, just read it. He's smart enough. The technology, as Eric was talking about, Chance is brilliant. He can just pick it up right away, anything, new TVs, anything, he can deal. But Chance shared some thoughts with me. And I said, Chance, when I'm out of town,
Carey?
What do we need to do as far as you reading a proverb? He can pick up the phone, and the phone will read the proverb to him. And I think about all the research and all that we have, and please forgive me for going as long as I have, but the Tennessee Titans last weekend, I'm in Florida, spoke at every NFL team. Guys, how many of you don't know your dad? Tons of hands go up. What's one word to describe your father? Many of them. Liar, cheater, absent. Some of them will say faithful, but they're broken. And when we share with them about family, believe it or not, these guys, some of the greatest athletes, politicians and folks, that have that wound, but the research that you have will help us go to another level. And we had some other great thoughts, but my pastor that trained me taught me that a good talk or a good sermon is like good sausage. You can cut it off anywhere and you have the same thing.
It's funny, I thought that it had to have 3 points, all starting with the same letter. But that's Presbyterian, I guess, not Episcopalian, so what do I know? Okay, so let's go on to Elaina.
Good morning, everybody, and I want to also thank the Institute and thank Ashley for inviting me here today and providing this forum for us to kind of take the academic and the research work and figuring out how it hits the road practically, because we don't always have that opportunity. I think a lot of times academic work can just stay in the academic arena, and practitioners don't always have the benefit of having especially that larger national scope available to them. So thank you for coordinating those efforts. And just in my role at Boys and Girls Clubs of America, I work at our national headquarters in our program development department. I've been there for about 9 years, and we're based out of Atlanta. And I spent about a year working on our Family Strengthening Initiative, which is how I connected with Ashley around this work. Just to give you an idea, I know not everybody is familiar with Boys and Girls Clubs to the same level, but we have 4,000 clubs nationwide. We're located in rural communities, urban communities, suburban communities. I see some nodding, so I know some folks are familiar with the work that clubs do. And we also have about 400 of those clubs that are located on military facilities, so they can be overseas in Asia and in Europe as well, where soldiers are deployed with family members and providing services for them. We provide after-school programming, a wide breadth of programming, whether it's supporting young people in their academic success or combating obesity, which came up in this report, through physical activity or looking at prevention programs or financial literacy, just a wide variety of activities that are done after school. And we serve youth ages 6 to 18. We serve about 4 million youth a year. About half of those are registered members, which means that they come a little bit more regularly, and we have some data on them. And just a couple data points that I wanted to share with this group was that we serve a predominantly low-income community. 64% of the young people who come to our clubs are from families who qualify for free or reduced lunch. And then again, among those members, 46% of them are from single-parent households. And I think the national average for youth in single-parent households is 34%. So just overall, we have a larger percentage of young people coming to us from those households, and who are probably seeking that support, because as a single parent, you really need to look for other outside resources. They play a greater role. So just a little bit of background information. In reading through the report, there's a lot of information that is striking and that has relevance for the work that we do at Boys and Girls Clubs. I already mentioned the obesity piece. The social networking and technology comes up all the time, and how do we reach teens and get them coming into our facilities and make sure that we're meeting their needs and when the world has changed so much, and how do we help caregivers to understand what's going on with them and in terms of Facebook and technology when it's changed so much before them. But one of the sections that really stuck out to me was that section on support, and it's come up several times this morning too, and just how parents have such a thin network of support out there. And I think when you work in after-school programming, you can kind of feel like everybody's connected somehow, but the report said that only 23% of parents have connections to after-school programming, or at least feel some level of support there, a moderate level of support. So clearly there's a big need out there that exists. And if you look at the 1 in 6 parents who feel like they have no support networks whatsoever, this is an area where I feel like social service agencies, community agencies, and places like clubs can really fill a need and make sure that we are looking at what kinds of supports our parents need, and are we fulfilling those needs. And how can we be, I think it was Megan mentioned the word allies, and that's something that we'll probably talk about more this afternoon or at lunch, but how can we be those allies that our parents need in parenting so they don't feel so alone out there? I wanted to just talk a little bit about some of the ways that our clubs are providing kind of very practical supports to parents. There's a wide variation in clubs out there and what they do, but those clubs who are supporting families well do it through a lot of practical resources. Just to give you a couple examples, there's a club in Alabama that I've been working with, and they have a small group of moms who get together who are in need of getting their GEDs. And they're actually paying the fee for one mom to go through the whole GED process. It's not expensive. I think she said it was $10 per test, and you have to take maybe 5 tests. It's really not a lot of money, but that fee in and of itself could prevent that mom from actually going through and getting her GED. And at least having somebody like a Boys and Girls Club staff checking in on you and saying, hey, how's it going, is another level of support they provide, so very practical. We also have a lot of clubs who are located in communities where you might have English speakers, or you might have parents who are not comfortable speaking English. So they provide translation services. One very practical application, again, was a club that said that they had parents bring in their utility bills or their phone bills, and they would translate those for them, because a lot of times they're depending on their kids to do that for them, and that's a very awkward, talk about reversing the roles of authority. If you're in an immigrant family or a new family that doesn't speak English, very often the child is having a lot more power because they're the ones who speak the language. And so they're serving as that translator, that cultural translator. So think about when a kid gets in trouble at school and they're translating that information back to their parents. Some of it might get left out in the translation or just not passed along at all, because nothing is, they don't want to share that information, and parents can feel very disempowered there. I think our clubs and other community organizations can also fill that need for fun in a kid's life. This came up at the end of the report in terms of practical applications. Parents are fearful about their neighborhoods and their communities, and they don't want their kids to walk someplace, so where can they go to just kick back and have fun? And where can parents go to have an environment where they don't have to pay any money. The club provided, one club talked about providing hot dogs and popcorn and a movie night. Very, very simple. But the parents were just so grateful to have that opportunity to not have to pay for tickets, not have to think about dinner that night, and have just a relaxing evening with their kids. And then finally, and again, I think we'll talk about this more a little later, but I think that places like Boys and Girls Clubs can serve as that community connection point. And when we see clubs doing a great job with families, that has come up among parents. Parents who are low income, they may be working 2 jobs, they may be struggling with illnesses, or have children with behavioral problems, or they can't find a job. I mean, these are not topics that we really want to tell people about or feel comfortable talking about necessarily with a lot of people. So if they can connect parents who are facing similar issues, and then they feel like they're not so alone, and kind of address some of those isolation issues out there. So there's a lot of work that can be done in community groups to play that role. And finally, I think that parents in general, I remember reading when I was doing a lot of work with family strengthening, just that parents really want to feel like they're doing a good job. And a lot of times, we always talk about how kids are born and there's no instruction manual. So we're really left to our own kind of devices, our own families, our own friends, whatever network we can create for something that is such a big job as parenting and has such large implications. What kind of support, as a culture, what kind of support do we provide to parents? And it's not necessarily something universal. There's bits and pieces. There's a lot of variation in what we get out there, and that definitely came up in the report. And I think that need to feel like you're doing a good job also came up in terms of seeing how connected parents, how their own identity is connected to their children and how their children are doing. So a lot of things that kind of overlapped and that I really felt like were kind of reaffirming for our work and showed us some places where we need to build out as well, and how can community groups help parents understand where they can improve and how they're doing a good job and provide that education. So thank you very much for presenting the report findings and for me being a part of that. I really appreciate it. I just wanted to say that I hope this opens up kind of a national dialogue around parenting in general in our society and where we need to improve. And I know you guys don't do policy, but how that has some implications on a larger scale. Just on another personal note, I have a 2-year-old, so looking at our own kind of maternity leave policies and child care policies in the United States versus other countries and what that means for us and how that impacts our economic futures as well, I think is something else that's relevant for this.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elaina. Before Lisa goes, the comments that have come have reminded me of some other aspects of our research that you may really be interested in and that our research team can work with you on in the future. We have quite a bit of data on parental location. So parents being not geography so much, but rural, suburban, how large of a city, and attitudes towards education and attitudes, levels of support in that way. So if you are working with an organization that needs those breakouts, we do have that available. We also, most of our work on connectedness and support had to do with support as a parent. What kind of parenting support does one get? But we also asked a few questions about parents' friendships and connection to other adults, which is, I think, something important to a lot of organizations, and we do have data on that as well. And then finally, the survey asked a lot of questions about children's activities and very specific types of activities, and we have breakdowns on that as well, and differences in access to those. So I just remember from looking at it myself, one access to sports clubs is very different in different communities, and it has a lot to do with parental income. So that's another way that organizations can, anyway, just putting in a plug for ongoing access to this data. So thank you. And Lisa.
Hi, I'm Lisa Belkin. I write about parenting for the Huffington Post and have done it for years. Well, I haven't done it for the Huffington Post for years and years and years because they didn't used to exist, being that they are basically part of the problem that we are talking about, in that I live completely online. And before that, I did it for the New York Times. And so it's interesting that I used to write for very old traditional media, and I now write exclusively for new media, and yet the conversation is the same. Being a reporter, reading this report, for which I am so grateful because it is a codification of the anecdote that fills my inbox every day. So all day, every day, my team talks to parents, listens to parents, watches parents talk to each other, and the internet has become, in a way, the support system or a support system for a good number of parents. It is a place where you can go in the middle of the night when you don't know what to do, and you can type things in and strangers can answer your question. You can make friends with other parents who happen to also have a child with the same disability, issue, crisis as yours, who you never would have gotten to meet before. So it is a parenting tool. It is not just the thing that invades our house. And the thoughts I had reading the report were basically about the questions. I don't have any answers. All I have are questions. But they are all questions raised about the difference between the old and the new, the then and now, the what is real and what is perception. So I'm just going to go through some of the questions that came up while I was reading, which are the questions as a reporter I would ask in order to write this more thoroughly, and that some of which are what parents are asking. So the idea of delusion versus reality, all through this report are examples of parents who think they know X when Y is actually true. And we see this all the time in real reporting life. I have never met someone who says they are a helicopter parent or an overly involved parent. They all know people who are helicopter parents and are overly involved parents, but not them. And the same applies to, yes, other kids are not doing what they should in school, but not theirs. Other children are not following the teachings of their parents, but never theirs. And I am not one of those who thinks this is, denial and obnoxious so much as I think it really reflects parents' desire to be doing their best and fear that they aren't. So they're always looking for evidence of what they're doing right or wrong. But what it also does, in effect, is mean that we can't necessarily trust any of the rest of the answers that we have here, or parents can't necessarily trust their instincts. So we know that 95% of them think they know what their kids are doing online, but only 35% do. So when they then tell us other things, like they are worried about their children going out into the world, well, we know we can't trust their reasons for doing that. And I find that one of the fascinating dichotomies of covering this. Here's my favorite fun fact. If you want your child, for some bizarre reason, if you want your child to be abducted by a stranger, if that is your goal, how long would you have to leave that child standing on a street corner alone in your neighborhood in order to guarantee that a stranger would come and take your child? 750,000 years. And yet it is the dominant fear of parents. On the other hand, you can be pretty much guaranteed that if you don't let your kid outside and play and have them sit in front of the TV, they are at risk for obesity or diabetes. That is a guaranteed risk. And yet parents will choose that over letting their kids outside to play. So what I would love to find a way to tackle is the disconnect for many parents, the well-intentioned, loving disconnect of many parents between the world they think they are raising their children in and the world that they are actually raising their children in. I'd also love to find a way to tackle this fear of the new, which relates to the idea of what the world really is and what we think it is. So we all sit and talk in great detail about how we are being changed by technology, and technology is making it more difficult to be a parent, and we can't be the parents that our parents were. And it's all awfully familiar, isn't it? I mean, in the 1920s, parents were scandalized by the way their children were dressing. And when the telephone came along, parents were certain that this was going to be the end of conversation at night over the dinner table. And I've read accounts that said that when the ballpoint pen came out, people were outraged that this would make it impossible to educate children properly because they would not be forced to learn good penmanship. I mean, this is what kids are supposed to do. They're supposed to find the thing that their parents don't understand and run with it. And so we might be at risk of making a little too much of the end of the worldness of technology. Much more practical, I think, is, okay, so what are the actual changes of this particular end of the world, as opposed to the changes wrought by all the previous ends of the world, and how do we find what's useful to us in that, and mitigate the things that aren't, and also just calm down a little bit. That texting story to me was gorgeous. It allowed a mother and a child to communicate in a way that probably they never would have before. I remember the day, excuse me, I made my peace with texting, which was when my son, who was then about 11 or 12, it was a brand new phone given to him for this occasion because he was going trick-or-treating with friends, and I didn't want to be completely out of touch, but I also wanted to give him the independence to go with his friends. And I got a text from my son that said, "Can you come get me and not say it was my idea?" Which allowed me to be a kind of parent that without that I could not have been. And so there are values to these, and the experience of learning how to live in your child's world, which is what we should be helping parents do. It's familiar to every immigrant who comes not knowing a culture and having to have their kid teach it to them. It's not new. So what I would love to do is find a way to change that lens so that we're not looking at this as, the evil awful, but we're looking at it as just something else that works. I mean, the Huffington Post is a place where people come and say things that I don't think they've necessarily said out loud to the people closest to them in their life. Is that a shame on one level? Yes, it is. It would be wonderful if they had the person closest to them in their life to say it to. But is it also something remarkable that they can say, I worry that I'm angry at my child too often, help me? Yeah, this is a new tool that we have. It's a new way to use things.
Lisa.
And now I'm done.
Sadly, because I could have listened to everyone all afternoon. I think what Lisa raised really calls us to examine that question of, are parents too worried about some things and maybe not worried about others? How can we, as people who work with families, negotiate this? Help figure out what really needs to be worried about and how much. So I think what we'll do, because we're running a tiny bit behind, is see if there are maybe 2 questions that people want to pose to the panelists or discussion points, and then we'll have a brief break and go to our panel. Are there? Carl.
Yeah, a couple of things. One is just a word of clarification on
Wait, no one can hear you.
A couple of things. A word of clarification on tables that show breakouts on various questions in the survey. We will be putting online a report that has those tables. We expect it to be online, that one, late January, early February. But it'll be up at our site, and it'll break things down by socioeconomic categories, urban, rural, et cetera. And that's my plea to you, to be patient with us, because if we have requests for all this information that we're putting up anyway, it will make my life more difficult. The other thing is the questionnaire in the survey report does have the frequency distribution, so that will be available for everyone at the beginning of December.
Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, just the percentages of response on each question. That's part of the full survey report, and that one is just about available. Those are coming out early December. We can send you copies of that, and that'll also be available for download. Finally, I want to remind people on this technology issue that one of the things I tried to point out this morning was that parents' attitudes towards the technology, even the social networking, is they say they think it's been generally positive for society. So they struggle with how to manage it, but they do have a positive attitude. And one thing that was striking to me, I'm not quite sure what to make of it, but we have a question in the survey that says, if you had a serious concern about your child's moral or ethical development and you were unsure what to do, how likely would you be to turn to each of these sources? And information sources on the internet have almost exactly the same distribution as turning to scripture or religious teachings. As a matter of fact, there are slightly more who say they would turn to information sources on the internet than
That
to
scares me a little
scripture.
as one of the internet sources, but okay.
But I'm just saying it's clearly a mixed bag in terms of how parents are responding to this.
Thanks.
Thank you. Gary Council, Adventist Chaplaincy Ministries. The paradigm obviously has shifted, and the concept of a central authority is diminished. You have now the various community clubs, you have peer-to-peer, parents going to peer-to-peer on the internet, and now young people, of course, getting many of their values peer-to-peer. Was there any review or look at decision-making models? Who decides the values? And how do people decide them today? Because there's so much information. How do we filter? How do we determine? What are the principles we're going to live by? And with all of this information coming, who is the determiner of those principles? This is a big issue. We need some kind of decision-making model, it seems to me, to help guide our young people, our parents, into sorting some of this out. Was any of that addressed?
I'm going to let Carl, James, Carl. So I don't think we had a decision-making model per se, because our team was looking at the perceptions that parents have now and their moral behaviors now and their moral ideas now. As to how they got it, that's
By decision-making models, you mean the ways that they try to regulate and control? Is that?
Yeah, how does a young person or a parent today sort through all of this, and, that is coming from various authoritative sources?
Okay,
to
so
determine what is right for me, what works for.
So that's the dilemma of living in a pluralist society, right? Where there are lots of diverse beliefs and behaviors and sources of authority.
That's actually what I found fascinating about this report, and it's a story I just finished writing, was whereas this study changed my lens on that question. I had long thought of it as people saying, what is my parenting strategy? What is my parent philosophy? What kind of parent am I? Which is where you get all these labels and shelves full of books about free-range parents versus, the tiger moms versus, and so it's what, you start with what kind of parent do I want to be? And what this reflected to me was that in a way is the wrong question. It's the kind of parent you are grows out of who you are. And looked at that way, there can be no central authority. But we can at least recognize why we all look at this thing called parenting, which is actually very simple. You raise your children to be as safe and as good and as successful as you can. And yet we all look at that same thing and come out all over the place. And so this is an explanation to me of why. That the parent next to me in the supermarket actually does see the entire world differently than I do, and that affects what they see as their role as a parent.
The detached, the American dreamers, the faithful, and the engaged progressives. So we asked our three panelists to give a response and some thoughts on those and their significance. I would like to introduce our panelists. We have Sheila Garcia, who is from the Secretariat of Family and Life. From the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. Felicia DeHaney, who is president and CEO of the National Black Child Development Institute, and Brad WIlcox, who is the director of the National Marriage Project and the associate professor of sociology at UVA. So, Sheila, would you start us off?
Well, it certainly comes as no surprise to you that the Catholic Church strongly affirms the role of families in forming moral character. I think we can say that in confidence along with other faith traditions. So by looking at this task through the lens of parenting, the research certainly offers us as a faith community some very valuable insights and raises, along with that, some important concerns. What I want to do is just identify 5 brief points that I picked up from the study, talked with my colleagues about, so we kind of have a consensus around this, really quickly to throw these out. First one is that faith communities traditionally have played a major role in helping parents to form the moral character of their children. So it is really disturbing to us to see the apparent erosion of this role among the various groups, the 4 groups identified in the study, with the exception of the so-called faithful. This loss of authority, of course, is not limited to the church. It's certainly being experienced by other institutions in society as well. But it is of considerable concern to the church. The reason being is that the legitimacy of church teachings doesn't depend on some kind of appeal to institutional authority, but it's that authority that is passing on those teachings to people, in our case through dioceses and parishes around the country. So when there is a perceived weakening of that authority, that is going to have a major impact. Second point, the research finds that many parents, and especially those who are called the engaged progressives, say they want their children to think for themselves. And what this seems to me to be very often is a rejection of religious authority and teachings. In other words, if you think for yourself, then that automatically means that you reject any kind of faith authority. There seems to be a belief among these parents that faith and reason are incompatible, which is certainly something that we would take great issue with. Seeing that mutual relationship between faith and reason is really just basic to our tradition. We do realize, though, that people no longer accept something just because the church teaches it, that they really want to know the why behind the teaching, not just the bottom line. So this is definitely a major challenge to us and an opportunity to present our teachings in a way that is attractive. Third point, the detached group obviously exhibits a kind of apathy, isolationism in regard to parenting and family. But here we see an opportunity for faith traditions. They can potentially perform a great service by welcoming this group into a community. If you go by the axiom that faith is more caught than taught, then what faith communities could do is to give these parents an exposure to community through putting them into contact with vibrant, faith-filled parents. So there's an opportunity there. Fourth, the American Dreamers group is of particular concern to the Catholic Church because of its high proportion of Latinos in the group. The Catholic Church is experiencing a major demographic shift with increasing numbers of Latinos. 39% of U.S. Catholics are Latino, and a majority of the millennial generation of Catholics is now Latino. So we would like to pay particular attention to this American Dreamers group. Fifth and finally, we see running through the report a separation between religion and faith on the one hand and morality on the other. Now, the classic Christian tradition has always seen these as linked, that faith and religion are intimately connected with morality. But what we have seen, especially in recent years, is a tendency to we see an unhinging of rules and regulations and norms with no foundation in faith and belief in God. They're just kind of out there. The church has recognized this problem. We've seen a shift in our own moral theology to emphasize more the formation of the virtuous person. So we're kind of getting away from an emphasis just on norms and rules, although those are certainly certainly important, but they're to be followed not for their own sake, but because they express what it means to live a virtuous life. These norms, we believe, are written in the human heart. They're not simply a matter of some external principle. So, in light of the classic Christian moral tradition, none of the four family cultures is fully identified with what the Catholic Church would understand to be the moral life. Even the faithful, the so-called faithful, would need pastoral attention because they would see the moral life as basically conforming to an external source. We feel this conception is incomplete. In the Catholic tradition, abiding by moral principles and living virtuously are always what is best for everybody. This is what we call the common good. So it's possible that in this way, the bridge between the faithful and the engaged progressives might be bridged. Final point, the Catholic Church also sees a renewed awareness of the link between religion, faith, and morality as a task that's relevant to all four family cultures, albeit in different ways. Perhaps a renewed understanding of how these are linked could help us to overcome the gaps that are identified in the study.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much. One of the things that you said about engage progressives and think for yourself, I would encourage you all to talk to Jeff and Carl as well about, but particularly Jeff, because in the interviews, no matter which family culture or which, the term think for yourself emerged fairly consistently. And one of the things that Jeff did is to drill down into what parents actually seemed to mean when they said think for yourself. And curiously, it quite often meant think like the family, don't think like the peers. So, Jeff, do you want to say anything about that, or should we talk about that?
Yeah, so that question has been asked in a number of different studies in terms of priorities for children and parents. So, and thinking for yourself comes up very highly for several decades. In our study,
so in our interviews, we asked parents that same question, and the vast majority value thinking for yourself. But then we were able to ask what they mean by that. And there is a portion of parents that mean the kind of self-fulfillment, autonomy that you would expect. But that's actually a minority. 28% of the parents that we interviewed that gave that kind of explanation for what they meant by thinking for yourself. The more, the more frequent explanation was thinking for yourself is a kind of internalization of the parent's morality.
Yeah.
So not doing the wrong thing, doing the right thing. So the language becomes much, it's a right and wrong language.
Yeah.
And so thinking for yourself is actually standing up for and doing the right thing. And that sense of right and wrong most frequently comes from the parents themselves. So it's a sort of a kind of interesting story where the language is independence and thinking for yourself, but they still mean an influence that the parent has on the child to make those kinds of right decisions when given.
So once again, we hope that you'll be able to look at the data that we have when all the other reports are available and be able to say, well, this will even help me target these distinctive populations better, and to understand the language, what it really means, no matter how it's being deployed. Felicia.
Thank you so much to the Institute, and Ashley, thank you so much for inviting us here today. And as I was sitting there on the first panel, I had all these notes on my page, and I said to myself, well, my mom's Presbyterian and my dad is Protestant, so I have to make it work. I don't have three, but I'm going to stick to my notes and be in between, right? So thank you again for having us. At NBCDI, we talk a lot about culture, and as I'm, again, listening to some of the questions that are even followed up, and we talk about this internal view and how connected all of this is to culture. We live it, we study it, we celebrate it, and we definitely stretch our arms to make sure that others are comfortable learning it. It's not a comfortable thing talking about culture, because then you get straight into race and ethnicity, and that makes it uncomfortable. But we at NBCDI like when people are uncomfortable when we're talking about race, because that means they're actually authentically concerned about how dynamic culture is and how much race and ethnicity and everything that embodies culture really matters. So As we embark on our work around culture and our families, we know that it is directly linked to history and communities, and we concern ourselves on different levels of culture, which in the report really had a nice connect where we talk about culture in the concrete, behavioral, and symbolic forms of culture, as does the cluster analysis here, leads to the 4 types of family culture. So although this was an academic and professional exercise, as I read it, I really felt confident that most people who read this will put their eyes on their own family, right? So which culture were we raised in? Which one do we fit? What type of parents are we? And I kind of, found myself between the faithful, part progressive, part dreamer, everything but detached. I'm one of those parents like, not my child, right? So definitely not detached. Who really wants to be detached, but obviously from the data, people are comfortable in those, checks that actually lead to this definition. And this is a problem I'm sure we'll talk about later, but first, because we believe in the amazing power of culture and diversity, I wanted to point out how important it is to celebrate the fact that we have different cultures at all, and to think about the intricate ways in which they come together to complement each other and challenge us to think a little deeper as we're reading this report. And that's why a couple things jumped out at me, and again, I'm going to try to stay with my time here, but one of the things in the report was the fact that 69% of the participants agreed that we would all be better off if we could live by the same basic moral guidelines. So of course I said, wow, so much for diversity, huh? So because I suspect, as I was reading this, that these 69% of participants specifically that said they'd be better off, is it that they would be better off based on their own or based on someone else's moral guidelines? I also suspect there's a significant overlap between the 69% and the 64% who feel that the family life has declined, but who also feel that with their family in particular, as the report notes, actually we're doing extremely well. So before we move on, I really want to, highlight and remember that 75% of Americans report being satisfied with their own child's school, but only 44% are satisfied with the quality of U.S. education. So that was kind of an overlap of what I felt needs to just go a little deeper in this report. So which U.S. students would these Americans be talking about if they're not talking about their own? So thinking about that, we take on this perception of family decline. So less than 50% of the Black participants in the study believe that American family life is declining, compared to 70% of whites and about 55% of Hispanics. So what's going on here? I'm not a researcher, but this is just my thoughts. So are whites who feel family life is declining talking about their own family or their neighbor's family or the families they see on TV? Are whites who feel that, or are they talking about the families that they see across other cultures or other races? Or that, as a recent report that I was reading came out, America would be fine if it wasn't for all those different people. People who don't speak English, people whose names we can't pronounce, rap music, drop pants, all of those things. So are Hispanics here right to be legitimately concerned that the more generations they spend in the U.S., the worse their children do on some social emotional measures? Or are Black folks just super, super optimistic? So my sense as I read all of this and I look at the research that's being done across race and parenting across the United States, there's as we talk about these 4 cultural values, I believe they're largely dependent on the basic demographic factors such as race, ethnicity, and social class. And all these factors play a tremendous role in understanding why only 22% of America dreamers are Black, and while 2% are engaged progressive. And how do we use this information to work more effectively with parents across these cultures and the cultures as they are traditionally understood or often stereotyped? Finally, if culture is the world that children inhabit, as this document notes, we believe that culture is also the lens through which children learn the rules of relationships that enable them to develop. And these relationships are, in the end, what really, really matter. A brief note of caution, some of the conversations, and as we look across studies that talk about parenting, and again, the sensitivity that comes around the dynamics of culture, that as we move forward, we must always remember that culture is both dynamic and monolithic, and that, in fact, children and parents deserve to be recognized as individuals within the cultural context in which they live. And we must be mindful when we have conversations and put research out. That, as one parent said to me as I went into their program, I need you all to understand, don't do for me without me. So as we do these conversations, make sure that we engage, and we make sure that the people who we are talking about reflect us, even here today. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Felicia. The first conversation I had with Felicia, she has wonderful degrees herself. She is being modest. She is outstanding in her field with research as well. And said to me, it's really important how we tell the story. How we tell these stories matters. And that made a difference as how we constructed this. And I think you're right to remind us that that's important as we have this conversation about practice. So thank you. Brad?
Thank you, Ashley. One of the abiding fissures in American life that was exposed by last week's presidential election was religion, or sort of the religious dimension of American life. Exit polls indicated about 60% of Americans who regularly attend church voted for Mitt Romney, and about 60% of Americans who rarely or never attend religious services voted for Barack Obama. And of course, this religious divide would have been even sharper were it not for the fact that many church-going African Americans and Latinos pulled the lever for Obama. Differences over family-related matters, from same-sex marriage to abortion, were at the root, I think, of last week's religious divide in voting. Secular progressives were attracted to Obama's strong support for same-sex marriage and abortion rights, just as religious conservatives were repelled by his positions on these very same issues. Given the importance of family-related issues to last week's race, it's no surprise that the cultural divide so evident in the political arena also extend to the family arena, according to this new report that we're speaking about today, The Culture of American Families. The report reveals that American parents are divided into 4 cultural camps, and of course 2 of these camps, the faithful and the engaged progressives, roughly conform to the red and blue narratives that now have wide currency in our culture. The faithful make about 20% of American parents and are largely white and middle class, believe strongly that, quote, God's timeless truths, unquote, about sex, marriage, and life remain as true today as they've always been. They seek to defend these truths in the broader culture, and failing that, aim to, quote, buffer themselves from progressive currents enough that their families will remain faithful to their traditions, unquote. And in keeping with their cultural commitments, they are more married than any other group of parents. They have more kids than any other group of parents. They attend religious services more than any other group of parents, and they spend more time with their kids than do most parents in the sample. And indeed, I think one of the more interesting sort of side notes here is one of the reasons that they're so invested in their kids' lives, that they believe that fathers play as an important role in kids' lives as do mothers, and believe that dads should act accordingly. And then finally, in terms of kind of their broader outlook, it of course tilts red, with 62% supporting Romney in this report compared to just 12% for Obama. By contrast, the engaged progressives, who make up about 21% of American parents and are whiter, better educated, and more affluent than the population as a whole, march to a very different beat than do the faithful. They steer clear of organized religion. They believe strongly in the virtues of personal freedom, choice, and tolerance, and seek to form their children into, independent-minded adults in ways that Jeff mentioned just a second ago. But their individualist commitments are also tempered by a belief in the golden rule, and a kind of golden rule ethos that's linked to things like honesty, virtues like honesty, openness, empathy, and compassion for the vulnerable. And their cultural commitments point them politically into, or in a blue direction, with a clear majority supporting Obama and only 18% indicating that they would be voting for Romney. Ironically, however, whatever their cultural differences with the faithful, engaged progressives live lives that look much like their cultural opposites. They're almost as married. They're about as likely to have stay-at-home moms in the home when they've got preschool kids around. And they devote more time to their kids than to parents as a whole. So in many respects, and in pursuit of their progressive ideals, they rely on largely kind of neo-traditional behaviors, including marriage and intensive parenting style. The same cannot be said about the other two cultural camps or groups that are articulated in the report, that is the detached particularly, and also the American Dreamers, who make up respectively 19 and 27% of American parents. Although a slight majority of the detached are married, this largely white, downscale group is made up of parents who seem to be incapable or unable to exert much influence in their kids' lives. They spend comparatively little time with their kids. They're disconnected from the religious and civic fabrics of their communities, and they seem to allow television and other outside influences to set the cultural agenda for their children. Indeed, the report contends that the detached parents, quote, lack the vision, vitality, certainty, and self-confidence required to embrace any agenda for their children. By contrast, the American Dreamers, who are disproportionately working class and minority, have high hopes for their children. They believe strongly in education, and they want their children to make good on the American dream. But given that marriage is more fragile in this sector of American parents, given that they have less income than American parents as a whole, and given that they're not as engaged in their kids' lives as are the faithful and the engaged progressives, it's not entirely clear to me that the American Dreamers can make good on the dreams that they have for their children. Indeed, although the media, the activists, and the politicians have been focusing much of their attention on the faithful and engaged progressives fighting culture wars over matters like abortion and same-sex marriage, the deteriorating economic, civic, and familial fortunes of the dreamer, and especially the detached families, should garner, I think, much more of our attention in the public square. For regardless of the dreams of their fathers and mothers, children from these latter two groups are not likely to get ahead unless and until the economic, civic, and familial fortunes of their families are set upon stronger and more stable ground. Thanks.
All right. Thank you all for adding to our food for thought here before we do break for lunch. Does any of our researchers want to comment on any of the things that were said or suggested at this point? Megan or Carl? Jeff?
I would add one small thing to Brad's, and that is, Carl, can you stand up?
Yeah, Carl's coming to the mic. Mike is coming to Carl.
Sorry, I have a lot of voice left. The comparison between the faithful and engaged progressives, Brad, was very helpful and on target, I think, in terms of what the report says. And your observation, I was glad you brought out the bit about stay-at-home moms, that the numbers are about the same between those two groups. What's interesting, though, is that among the faithful, many more of those persons identify as homemakers. And so while they are both stay-at-home moms, the symbolic reality for the two groups is different. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a lot of talking left and right in these two, communities, even though they sort of walk right across the board.